I will admit, though, I'm a little worried. They gave me 15 minutes to talk, and I definitely have more than 15 minutes of material here, so phones down, pencils down. Let's roll, because we're going fast. Today I want to talk about power. We don't talk about power very much, specifically who has it, who doesn't have it, where it comes from, how to get more of it. And it's a dangerous word in polite discussion. It's like when you're at a dinner party and you know politics in particular comes up, the conversation will often shift to a language of opportunity, mobility. They imply that everything can be a win-win, and they keep people pretty comfortable in their seats. Well, I think that era of staying comfortable in our seats should be over, because power is changing fast in America, and middle class and poor people are losing it. When I talk about power, for the sake of today, what I mean is the ability to self-actualize, to arrange the world of people, places, things in a way that suits your own will. The most powerful are those who have the fewest constraints, who can do what they want, when and how they want. And I think that the American dream, which has too often been more of a myth than a reality, is not about white picket fences and the suburbs. It's about achieving the power to decide for yourself who you want to be. And even though the stock market is at near record highs and unemployment is now back down below 4%, it hasn't been this good since 2001, the reality is that the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, your kids will do better than you, that is fundamentally under threat in our country today. Every American wants their kids to have more choices than they've had. Where to live, who to marry, what job you want to do. My parents certainly wanted this for me. So I grew up in a little town in North Carolina called Hickory. It's at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It was an old furniture manufacturing town before a lot of those factories moved overseas. And as I talk about in the book, as Mika alluded to, my dad was the son of a country club groundskeeper, the people who make the physical plan of a country club nice and pretty for the rich people who play there. My father later became a traveling paper salesman. My mom was a public school teacher. Her parents were mill workers for nearly the entirety of their lives. Now, both of my parents did much better than their parents had done economically. And that economic freedom gave them more security to choose who they wanted to be, start a family, to have me. And they hoped that that march of progress would continue in a linear fashion for me. And if you take a step back and just look at my bio, for instance, it sort of looks a little, it smells a little like the American dream. I got financial aid to go from Hickory, this small town in the middle of nowhere, to a fancy boarding school, Phillips Andover. From there, I got a scholarship to go on to Harvard. And there I roomed with Mark Zuckerberg. We started Facebook our sophomore year, and it exploded. And I did 3 years worth of work on the communications, marketing, and product development teams and earned nearly $500 million before I was 30 years old. There is nothing that you can call that but a lucky break. That is not how the American dream is supposed to work. It's not up by your bootstraps, hard work over the course of a lifetime. It is something very and profoundly different. The thing is, though, while my case may be extreme, it's unfortunately not that uncommon. We have structured the economy to create outcomes like mine, time and time again, while everybody else struggles to make ends meet. And to call my experience just like a random fluke or like the lucky roommate of Mark Zuckerberg undermines the fact that our economy has actually been engineered by people in power to create this kind of outcome again and again. What's really happening is that poor and middle-class families in America are losing power, while stories like mine create an illusion of economic opportunity that doesn't exist. And I'll go through a couple of the stats quickly, because many of you probably know them. But social mobility in the United States is near an all-time low. If you're born in poverty in France, you're more likely to be rich than if you're born in poverty in the United States. Median household incomes, they haven't budged since the 1970s in any meaningful way. And perhaps more surprisingly, small business starts. The rate of entrepreneurship in our country is near an all-time low. Americans are moving far less often than they have before, and the cost of housing in our cities is skyrocketing, just as education and childcare are at the same time. And it's important to say that some groups are more disempowered than others. The average net worth for a white family, 10 times what it is for an African-American family or a Hispanic one. On average, a woman still earns 80 cents on the dollar for what a man earns, and that adds up, because just in 1 year, a woman on average makes $10,000 less than a man. Americans are not just losing power, though, through economic stagnation. It's in our politics, too. The flood of money and special interests that elected officials spend dialing for dollars, calling people like me instead of talking to their constituents, that's contributing to the power loss. At the same time, corporate monopolies and oligopolies are constraining consumer choice while giving the illusion of abundance. And when power is concentrated in fewer hands, as it increasingly is, supply chains become more brittle, consumer choice is constrained, innovation slows. We think we live in one of the most creative times, but in reality, our rates of productivity in the economy are flat, stagnant, and much lower than they were decades before, and small business starts mirror the same. I would argue that we've lost the vocabulary and the conceptual tools to think about how to hold concentrated corporate power accountable. And because a lot of us in this room grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s, at the same moment when we stopped enforcing antitrust law in the United States, it means we don't even have the conceptual framework to talk about how problematic it might be that companies like Amazon, Google, Walmart, and yes, Facebook may be too large. Neoliberal economics coined the term free market in the mid-1950s and neglected hundreds of years of economic history that shows that markets work best when they're well-regulated and power is counterbalanced. Today, we don't even have a language to use to think about how to regulate the concentration of corporate power. But if we want to rewrite those rules, we're going to have to start. One idea on this point. At this moment, there's a growing movement of legal scholars and activists thinking about whether tech companies should be held to a higher legal standard. This is patterned off of what we already have in the law called fiduciary responsibility. The idea that a person is required to act in the best interest of a client, like a doctor and a patient, or a lawyer and a client, or an accountant and their client. Whenever you have this asymmetrical power relationship where one party has a lot of power, we expect the powerful party to have a responsibility to care for their client. Given how much Alphabet and Facebook and others know about us, and not just about us, but all of our friends, we can and should consider holding them to a higher legal standard, ensuring that they are not just self-policing. But these three powerful trends, stagnant wages and unstable work, waning political power, and a small set of historically massive corporations writing the rules for their own benefit, have created an America where people rightly feel less and less in control of their own destinies. The rising tide of nationalism and populism in our country is grounded in, yes, in economic frustration, for sure, but it's bigger than that. It's a cultural sense that everyday people are losing their voice and their ability to know that their family and their kids will be happy and healthy in the long term. We have to turn the tide. Here's how I think we should do it. First off, we have to agree to think comprehensively and aggressively about what should be done. Enough with the incremental solutions that just nibble around the edges of the problems and don't change the fundamental underlying dynamics of how our economy works and who it works for. The economy that we live with today has been 50 years in the making. These are not small problems that we have to solve, but we owe it to ourselves to be bold. Second, we need a broad and diverse set of practitioners who come from every walk of life, to roll up their sleeves and apply their talents where they can. Students and researchers, activists, organizers, we need app creators, we need people running for office. We need young and old, black and white, rich and poor alike. Thirdly, Let's agree that there are no magic bullets. Because power is multifaceted and complex, giving more of it to working people will require working on multiple fronts at the same time. We need campaign finance reform. We need universal child care. We need Medicare for all. We need smarter city planning and better housing policy. We need all of these interventions and more. But let's also not overlook the fact that sometimes the simplest solution is the best. Cash. By definition, money is the most liquid, fungible source of power. It enables an individual to decide what she wants, where she wants to go, what she wants to do with her time. Money is not power per se. You need to have a good option set to choose from and the skills to think it through, what you want and what you need. But in a world like the one we live in today, cash is the most powerful lever that we can pull to empower the Americans who need it most. Now, there are a lot of ways to get more cash in the hands of working people. You can lower taxes that the working people pay. You can reduce the cost of housing and services, like transportation, childcare. You can restructure markets to lower the price of goods. We should do all of that. But for the sake of today, I want to focus on how we can use regular cash transfers to provide freedom and dignity to all Americans. The idea goes by a lot of different names. Right now, the term du jour is UBI. It's also called a guaranteed income or social dividend. And there's a robust debate about how much it should be, who should get it, how long, and why. And people have been advocating different versions of this policy for centuries. Thomas Paine, Milton Friedman, Martin Luther King Jr., Richard Nixon. But today, the idea is getting a lot of attention because people like Elon Musk are concerned about the rise of the robots. But my argument is we don't need to settle the debate about whether jobs are going to disappear to know that Americans need more power and that cash is the most effective way to provide it. Now, in my view, $1,000 a month to every American would be too expensive and not necessarily focused on the people who need it the most. But I don't think of UBI as a particular policy or plan. I've worked in this space too long to know that people use that term in too many different ways. I think of it as a set of values that inspire a wide variety of policies. And those values are that every single person deserves the freedom and dignity to create her own future, and that cash is uniquely able to open that aperture of choice. I got my 2-minute sign and I got a video, so I'm going to go even faster. Building from that common value set, we should think creatively about how to achieve those ends. One route might be to change the tax code. This is what I argue for in Fair Shot. You could create a cash transfer of $500 a month to everybody who makes less than $50,000. $500 a month to everybody making less than $50,000. A supplemental amount to help make ends meet, not to enable anybody to put up their feet, drop out of the workforce, and just hang out. Another approach might be to create a social dividend. You could tax carbon. You could tax data. Distribute the proceeds to everyone. There are many ways of doing this, but the end result should be clear. A recurring regular stipend in the pockets of Americans who need it most. So if we agree that cash can provide freedom and dignity to each American, then I think we must ask every single person in this room, what can you bring to the fight? And what leader can you be? And over the past few years, I've had the privilege of working in a growing community of people, many of whom are here today, who've decided to dedicate their lives to this problem. And I want to introduce you very quickly to one woman. Her name is Aisha Nyandoro, and I gain inspiration from her work every week. But instead of speaking for her, I'll enable her to speak now on the video.
I don't think we realize that our future is really determined by what we're exposed to and what we're allowed to dream about. I knew growing up exactly what I wanted to do when I became an adult. I knew I wanted to run a nonprofit. I knew I wanted to work in the community. That's because my grandmother was an activist. That's because my mother and all of my aunties are social workers. So that was my level of exposure. Living in poverty, if you do not have people feeding into you what your future can be, that's why we have these generations of poverty that exist.
I don't know what Aisha saw in me to even offer me the opportunity that she did, but I'm so thankful. Will you make it to the class today? We want you to get a certificate of completion. Don't make me have to come to the 16D, ma'am.
We talk about there being a lack of leadership in these communities, and I don't think it's a lack of leadership. I think people are exhausted, and I think their bandwidth is taxed. But if I have my bandwidth freed up and I actually have the ability to think and breathe and dream, I think some of the leadership that is just naturally in these communities will begin to manifest again.
Prior to my job, I really didn't think that far ahead. I just worried about what was right now. I'm going to school for social work. I know that's what my calling is now, and that's because of my job. I want to be able to do it on my own. My reality is I can't. I'm not ashamed to say that I need help. I am here to help other people, but I'ma still need help.
If we just look at the number of folks who live in poverty in this country, the majority of them are women and their kids. And so having that ability to lift women out of poverty would be great. I think basic income could help in so many instances. Giving someone monthly cash would instill a sense of breathing room. I think it should be unconditional. I think we should trust people to know what it is that they need. I think having a basic income could really help transform communities across this country because local leadership would begin to show back up and flourish.
If I can get one person to listen and to hear, I feel like I did something for that day. If I can get two, I'm overwhelmed. I'm kicking my heels up.
Folks with limited income are just like you and I. They have the same dreams that we have. They want their kids to go to college. They want their kids to have bright futures. They want grandbabies. They want the white picket fence. They want the opportunity to take vacations. They want the same thing that we want. We're not different, and that's the piece that I really think we have all got to get to. Their dreams that I have for my son are exactly the same dreams that they have for their families.
So I want to close by highlighting the three things that we need most on this journey: data, stories, and organization. We know that study after study here in the United States has already shown that cash provides people with a level of economic mobility more significant than just about any other benefit. Hundreds of studies on cash have shown that kids do better in school, they stay in school longer, they do better on tests. Hospitalization rates go down, and rates of alcoholism and mental health issues decrease. Prime-age adults continue to work just as much as before, if not a little bit more. And perhaps more importantly, people live one step away from the brink. This is an immense amount of data, but we can and should have even more, because the more we know, the stronger our arguments will be. Second, we need stories like the ones from the communities that Aisha serves, not so much from Elon Musk. The mayor of Stockton, California is the kind of leader that I think we should get behind. His name is Michael Tubbs. He's 27 years old. He's the first African-American mayor of Stockton, California, and he's running a demonstration of this idea specifically to amplify the stories of the beneficiaries. We need these stories on the nightly news and Facebook feeds and person to person. Thirdly, we need organization. We need more people focused on how to achieve near-term ends through nonprofits and city and state governments in order to make the long-term case. In order to rebalance power, we have to build power in our own movement first. And I would encourage you, anyone who's interested in this, to join in the breakout group this afternoon, where I and several of my colleagues will be. In closing, I believe there's no better way to level the playing field and respect the fundamental freedom and dignity of each individual than through cash. Let's use every tool we have to get more of it in the hands of the people who need it most. Thank you.
So, Chris, thank you. That was an inspiring talk, and we're going to try and get to a couple of quick questions, if we can, off Slido if people are posting them. I'm going to throw one in just to get us started. My question is, how do you deal with the sort of cultural opposite of this, which is that, which I think is pretty strong in our country right now, which is that people have to deserve, if they're getting government help, like you have to work to get welfare. And that became bipartisan. It wasn't just Republican, it was also Democrat. So, how do you shift that?
I think there are multiple opportunities. The most prominent is learning a lot from what they do up in Alaska. Those of you who don't know, the Alaskans actually have a small little dividend. It's not that small, actually. It's $1,500 per person per year. So if you have a family of 4, that's $6,000. A reminder that median income is about $60,000 in the United States. So that's a 10% boost that you get every October to your bottom line. And up there, they don't think about it as welfare because it's a universal dividend. There, they fund it through a tax on oil that went into a savings account that's grown for decades, and they distribute it to everyone. It has many things that are unique to the Alaska concept, but it has a lot to offer. We could levy a tax on carbon. There are some folks who are talking about levying a tax on data. There are others who are talking about a robot tax to create a kind of sovereign wealth fund that would create a universal dividend. And in that scenario, I think what would happen is similar to what's happened in Alaska, which is a pretty conservative state where people break it out of the welfare frame and the deservedness frame and instead say, well, I created all this data. We all created this data that's fueling all of these corporate profits at Facebook and Alphabet that are historically high. I should have a piece of the economic upside, in addition to better privacy standards and other things as well.
Got it. So we have a couple of questions that have flowed in, and I can see that the top 2 are really bringing up the same broad question for you, which is that this question of power, the issues of racism, sexism, that we, how do you bring that into your analysis? Where does this fit? And the fact is that there are particular people who have been at the short end of the stick who are not, it's not random. It has been by race, by gender. So how does that fit into your analysis of how you build this movement for whatever you're going to call it, guaranteed basic income? Or
it is the analysis in itself, in a sense. The analysis is that we have these structures of power which have been engineered to specifically make it more difficult for people of color, for women, for the disabled, for many people to actually have the kind of economic opportunity that we talk about. There's like this collective nostalgia in the United States, which is like, if we could just go back to 20 or 30 years ago when we had all these great industrial manufacturing jobs. It's like, well, that's a really convenient nostalgia. That was mostly white men who had those jobs. And the myth, of course, culturally, is that of the welfare queen, if you will. The data doesn't show that. Labor force participation is higher for African American women than it is for white men. Just say that again. More African American women work proportionally than white men. So all of this is part of a mythology which we have to beat back against. And I don't want to say that it is. It's easy or it's simple. I mean, this has been decades in the making, and it will take time to shift.
So last question, since time is tight, but it's right there at the top, which is, what is the incentive for elites to give up power or money? I mean, obviously there are always a handful of enlightened people. You gave I think you're a good example of that. But for the most part, people think it's theirs, and they're not going to give it up without a challenge. So how do you answer that?
I think there are 2 ways, and the first is more pleasant than the second, so I'll start with that one. The first is that when that the biggest driver of economic growth is consumer spending. And consumer spending, when people don't have money to spend, the economic growth suffers. It's one of the big reasons that a lot of economists on the left believe that economic growth is as muted as it is today. And there was a study that the Roosevelt Institute did that showed that if we had a guaranteed income or a social dividend of some sort of $500 a month, the economy would grow over the next 8 years by as much as an additional 7 points on GDP. Which, for those of you who don't study this every day, that's like a 30-40% boost to economic output. And it's because of the intuitive idea, if you give $500 to somebody who's struggling to make ends meet, they're going to spend most of that on housing, healthcare, childcare, whatever's most urgent. You give $500, like the Trump tax bill did, to the ultra wealthy and corporations, that goes literally, we see, into savings account and stock buybacks. The kinds of things that don't go into the productive economy. So the first pleasant answer is that, well, it's good for you. It's better if the economy grows for everyone in the long term. The less pleasant answer is that I'm not sure that we necessarily need to talk in the language of incentives. If we can build enough power amongst middle class, poor, and certainly some upper class people, then we can rewrite the rules of our economy. We can change it in a way. And it may be that some people lose. But right now, already, most people in America are losing, and we've become very accustomed to that fact, and tipping those scales a little bit so that rich people don't make quite as much money, do have to pay more in taxes, I think is a good thing. And I think that making that argument, which is less pleasant but a little bit more confrontational, is what we're going to have to do to mobilize people to make the change.
Terrific. Well, many more questions to cover. That's why we're doing the workshop in the afternoon. So, folks, to go deeper on this, join Chris and his colleagues this afternoon after lunch. But thank you for broaching the conversation. All right.